Good afternoon, everybody. This is Teresa Duncan. Welcome to our webinar today. We are excited to share our review, and thank you for joining us. Let me just go over the agenda today, introduce you to our presenters, and give you a little bit of an overview before we launch into the first report. This is identifying and addressing discipline disparities. We will be presenting two reports today, one from REL Mid-Atlantic and one from REL Northwest, both of them addressing disproportionality and in discipline, looking at suspension and expulsion patterns in two different regions, in Maryland as well as in 6 districts in. We have 4 fine presenters today. You only have 3 showing here, but we have a 4th whose schedule change has serendipitously allowed us to bring her on board. So I will be facilitating today's discussion. Alan Porowski is going to be talking about the REL Mid-Atlantic report. He will be joined with his co-author, Rose O'Connor. Our colleagues at REL Northwest will be talking about the Oregon report. Arthur Burke and Vicky Nishioka will be sharing their results with us. And we're also very pleased to have 2 discussants from our regions. Robert Murphy, who is a school completion specialist at the Maryland Department of Education, and Sho Shigioka from the Beaverton School District. She is the district equity coordinator there. And so I'm not sure how many of you have been to our previous webinars, but if I may ask a little bit of your indulgence, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our program. The Regional Education Laboratories is a national federally funded program. We operate in regions, as you see here, and we have been around for almost 50 years. There are 10 regional labs across the United States, and throughout the 50-year period, we have responded to the educational needs of our regions. And for this particular 5-year cycle, we are working in research alliances with practitioners focusing on increasing data capacity, use of research by SEAs and LEAs, and working to produce rigorous research, providing technical assistance, and disseminating useful and accessible research-based products. And this particular webinar is an example of our work as we collaborate across the nation to support our stakeholders. The services the RELs provide, these are the main products. We provide direct research services as well as technical assistance products and services. We engage in ongoing need sensing as well as dissemination of our work. And so let me share with you just a few words about REL Mid-Atlantic before turning it over to Alan. We serve the Mid-Atlantic region, which is Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia. And our particular REL serves, works within 8 research alliances, and they're shown here in the middle of that circle. The disproportionality report emerged from a request from the Maryland Department of Education, and they are an active member of our School Completion and Engagement Research Alliance, which, as you see, has goals around improving capacity, increasing understanding, and networking among the stakeholders in the Mid-Atlantic region to learn more and prevent dropout. We've done several reports, several research syntheses and literature reviews under this particular research alliance. We are also conducting a randomized experiment in the School District of Philadelphia to look at absenteeism, and we've also conducted several bridge events around dropout prevention. And so, without further ado, let me turn this over to Alan Porowski and Rose O'Connor, and they will tell you all about disproportionality in Maryland. Alan?
Sounds good. Thanks, Teresa. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors, Rosemary O'Connor and Katerina Pasa, who both did incredible work to make this report the best it could possibly be, and did want to say that I was really honored to have them as co-authors on this paper. They did an incredible job. So first, some background about this report. This project had its roots in a July 2012 report put out by the Maryland State Board of Education, which was entitled School Discipline and Academic Success. The report concluded that school discipline policies needed to be re-examined and focus more heavily on rehabilitation instead of the punishment itself. And the report included proposed regulation from the state of Maryland that called for a method to monitor disproportionalities in discipline. And specifically, the regulation indicated that if a school system's rate of out-of-school suspensions or expulsions is found to be disproportionate for minority or special education students, the school system had to report annually how it's going to reduce that disproportionality within 1 year and eliminate it within 3 years. So in response to this report, and specifically to the proposed regulation, the Maryland State Board of Education directed the Maryland State to develop a method to monitor disproportionalities, and MSDE, which was part of our School Completion and Engagement Research Alliance, requested help from REL Mid-Atlantic to develop a method to analyze and really understand disproportionalities in school discipline for both minority and special education students. And we were naturally happy to take on this task because it really aligns perfectly with REL's mission to help SEAs and LEAs engage in data-driven decision-making. So we had two major research questions, and they're basically parallel questions for two different populations. So the research questions boil down to whether exclusionary discipline, which is defined as out-of-school suspensions or expulsions, are meted out in a way that has a disproportionate impact on two populations. So first, minority students relative to white students, and second, special education students relative to non-special education students. So as you can tell from what we presented a couple slides ago, these research questions address some of MSDE's core needs to implement the proposed COMAR regulation, or Maryland State regulation on discipline. So our first job was to identify the ideal method to measure disproportionalities. And our review of the literature indicated several ways of measuring these disproportionalities, including a composition index, for example, that looks at discipline rates for a subgroup relative to their representation in the total population, and a risk index, which involves a simple calculation of the rate of discipline for a specific group. But the method that directly compares two groups to each other, and by extension the method that most closely aligns with our research questions, is called the relative rate ratio. And this ratio is simply the rate of out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for one group compared to the referent group. So as you can see in this formula presented on this slide, if we want to understand disproportionalities in suspensions, for example, it's natural to compare the rate of suspensions and expulsions of black students to the rate of suspensions and expulsions for white students. And this ratio is very intuitive to interpret because it tells us just how much more likely black students, for example, are to be suspended or expelled than white students. So we were able to obtain 3 years of data from MSDE so we could look at trends in discipline over a relatively short-term horizon. So this report and the results that we're going to show you cover the 2009-2010 school year through the 2011-2012 school year. So this slide provides the big picture behind our numbers, and we'll get to the relative rate ratios in the next slide, but just as background, we had, from this slide you can see that we've generally seen a gradual decline in out-of-school suspensions and expulsions in Maryland for both special education students and students not in special education. So the percentage of special education students who were suspended or expelled in the 2009-2010 school year was 11.9%, and this dropped to 11.3% by the 2011-2012 school year. So likewise, the percentage of non-special education students who were suspended or expelled dropped from 5.6% in 09-10 to 5.0% in 2011-2012. So you can see this chart really has two big takeaways. First, there's been a gradual decline in out-of-school suspension and expulsion in Maryland over the past several years. And second, the rates of out-of-school suspension or expulsion for special education students is more than double that of non-special education students. This slide that you see here, slide 17, has the core takeaways in our report. And as you can see in the first set of bars, our calculation of relative rate ratios indicates that black students received out-of-school suspensions or expulsions at 2.8 times the rate of white students in the 2011-2012 school year. So as overall rates of out-of-school suspension and expulsion have been declining statewide, as we saw from the last slide, we see here that disproportionalities have actually increased between black and white students. Likewise, disproportionalities between multiracial and white students have also been increasing, and as well as special education versus non-special education, disproportionalities have also increased in recent years. You see here also that Hispanic students actually have lower rates of out-of-school suspension and expulsion relative to white students, and we can tell that since the relative rate ratio is less than 1. And with rates of out-of-school suspension and expulsion at more than twice that of white students, it's clear that black students clearly are being removed from school at disproportionate rates. This is a pretty big deal because, as us dropout prevention researchers like to say, dropout is a process, it's not an event. And one way to kickstart that process of disengagement is to remove kids from the school setting. That's not to say that all suspensions are not warranted, but it does beg for some creative approaches to keep kids in school, at least from a dropout prevention perspective. So we know that black students are removed from school at a disproportionate rate, but one possible explanation for this is that they commit more infractions or more severe infractions than other students. So to look at how minority students are treated within the school system, we examined whether minority students were removed from school at higher rates than white students for the same offense. And this examination was done for the 3 infraction types that accounted for 89% of all out-of-school suspension and expulsion in Maryland in the 2011-2012 school year. And among black students who were disciplined for attacks, threats, or fighting, 89.7% of those students received out-of-school suspension or expulsion, compared to 82.9% of white students. So the inverse of this number is the percentage of students who received in-school suspension, which is ostensibly a lesser punishment. So the implication of these findings is that black students are more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions or expulsions than white students for the same infraction type. And this pattern held across both disrespect, insubordination, and disruption, and the other category as well. One thing that we really cannot determine from these data is whether the severity of the infraction within each of these broad categories was different on average between minority and white students. But regardless, there's a pattern here that seems to indicate that students may be treated differently based on their race or ethnicity. And as evaluators love to say, more research is needed to deepen our understanding of these patterns.
Hey, Alan, can you give us some examples of the other category? What's in the other category?
Oh, the other category was really a catch-all. I don't have a list offhand, but I will come back to that in a second once I find it.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem at all. It's a very good clarification. So here's a glimpse of some of the other interesting findings from our report. So first, in all 24 local school systems in Maryland, black students were more than twice as likely to receive an out-of-school suspension or expulsion than white students. This relative rate ratio basically varied from 2.2 to 5.55 across these 24 local school systems, which indicates a pretty broad range of disproportionalities. And among special education students, racial differences in discipline were also evident. And we saw that black students in special education had higher rates of out-of-school suspension or expulsion compared to other special education students, and they were also removed from school at an average of 1.1 days longer than white students. So to conclude, there's some pretty large disparities here in the rates of out-of-school suspensions or expulsions, and especially when we compare removal rates for black versus white students. However, we also need to keep in mind that we didn't purport in this study to examine the root causes of these disparities. So we view this report as more of a conversation starter than anything else. And we now have a better understanding, at least, of the magnitude of these disproportionalities. We'll hear from Robert Murphy in a bit from MSDE about how Maryland is handling these data. But it's important to note that Maryland is ahead of the curve because we do have these new federal guidelines in place from the U.S. Departments of Justice and Education. And those guidelines, which were released, I believe, in January, ensure that school districts administer discipline in an equitable manner. The big challenge facing us now is that we know suspension is possibly inequitable and not a palatable solution to disciplinary issues. But we need to identify ways to keep kids in school, kids with discipline problems in school, in a manner that doesn't compromise teachers' ability to teach and students' ability to learn. So I did want to thank you very much for your time today, and if you do have any questions, of course there's time at the end of this webinar to ask questions, but please contact me or Rose, and we'd be happy to help. And I hope this top-line presentation offered some interesting insights for you, and hope, as I said before, this is really a conversation starter on a very incredibly important topic. Before I turn it over back to Teresa, I did want to give you some examples of other categories that could be in that other category from a couple slides ago. Things including academic dishonesty or cheating, portable communication devices like unauthorized cell phone use, theft, trespassing, vandalism, or refusal to obey school policies. So that other category really was quite a catch-all, but some of the issues like academic dishonesty and cheating, as you can probably imagine, had quite large representation within these discipline data.
Well, Alan, it looks like we've got a couple of questions that maybe we can address quickly since we're a couple of minutes ahead of time.
Okay,
so one question is about the special education students. Isn't suspension illegal, or are their students' rights being violated? So maybe Robert can also talk about that too.
Yes, it's my understanding that basically suspension can be legal as long as academic services are being provided to those students. So it's a slightly different mechanism, and I believe now that most of at least in the discipline data I saw, most suspensions or expulsions were accompanied by some kind of academic services. I don't know if Robert has anything more to add to that.
Okay. Well, we're going to take, there's several questions coming in, and so let me hold those until after Art and Vicki present. And so let me turn this over to Art Burke, who will, well, first Vicki, I apologize, Vicki, who will first tell us all about the REL Northwest work in Oregon and their research alliance, and Art, who will tell us about the findings. Vicki?
Thank you, Teresa, and it's my great pleasure to give you some background information about Oregon and the research alliances that we work with. REL Northwest serves 5 U.S. states that are on the other side of the country from Maryland: Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and of course Oregon. Our research alliance is a network called the Oregon Leadership Network that is formed together to focus specifically on equity. In Oregon, we pride ourselves on being what they call a locally controlled state, meaning that the state provides guidance through policy, but it really allows a great deal of discretion on how policy is interpreted into practice, and that includes the really important issue of discipline disparities. The Oregon Leadership Network has a membership of right now 16 districts, 3 education service districts, and 2 state education agencies, including the State Department of Education and higher education entities such as local colleges and universities involved in teacher preparation. It also includes the professional organizations of teachers and school administrators and school boards who provide professional development and support and really advocacy for these groups of professionals. So Oregon Leadership Network really touches across a full spectrum of organizations and districts that are involved in practice and policy within Oregon. In 2012, the OLN Research Alliance identified disproportionate use of exclusionary discipline as a key priority for their alliance. The following year, Oregon passed House Bill 219 to establish requirements for school policies related to discipline, suspension, or expulsion. The legislation required schools to have policies in place that protected school safety, emphasized prevention and establishment of positive learning communities, much in the same way that Maryland did. However, it did not dictate timelines or follow-up procedures that would happen if districts did not meet those obligations. It also explicitly states that discipline decisions should aim to keep students in school and should be imposed without bias. The Oregon Leadership Network asked 6 districts to form a task force that would focus on discipline, disproportionate discipline on their behalf. The task force identified the need to increase their use of data as one of their priorities. Specifically, they wanted to learn more about the problem, establish a baseline for Alliance work that was specific to the Alliance districts. They also wanted help to select indicators that would monitor their progress in eliminating disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsion for students of color, students involved in special education, and other groups that came up. So with that background, I wanted to now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Art Burke, who will explain and of our report.
Thank you, Vicki. Our study asked 4 research questions formulated in partnership with our alliance. What percentage of students were removed from regular classroom instruction because of exclusionary discipline? What were the most common reasons for exclusionary discipline? What percentage of students who were suspended received more than 1 suspension over the year? And what was the average number of school days suspended among students receiving at least 1 suspension? We also asked, how did exclusionary discipline, reasons for exclusionary discipline, rates of multiple suspensions, and days suspended vary by students' background characteristics? Over the 2011 and 12 school year, exclusionary discipline was imposed on 3% of students in elementary school, 11% of students in middle school, and 8% of students in high school. The highest rates of in-school and out-of-school suspensions were among middle school students. Out-of-school suspension was more common than in-school suspension at all grade spans. The largest difference was in high school, where the percentage of students receiving out-of-school suspension was 3 times greater than the percentage receiving in-school suspension. Expulsion was much less common than suspension. The highest rate of students receiving expulsion was at high school, and that was approximately 0.7% over the year. Across all grade spans, black students experienced exclusionary discipline at higher rates than students of other races and ethnicity. In elementary school, 10% of black students received exclusionary discipline. In middle school, 25% of black students received exclusionary discipline, and in high school, 16% of black students received exclusionary discipline. Black students received exclusionary discipline 3 to 4 times. That's 3 to 4 times more often than white students in the same grade spans. American Indian students received exclusionary discipline approximately 1.4 to 2.4 times more often than white students. Hispanic students received exclusionary discipline 1.3 to 2 times more often than white students. Multiracial students received exclusionary discipline approximately 1.3 times more often than white students. Asian students received exclusionary discipline at rates lower than other students, and about half of the rate for white students. Physical and verbal aggression and insubordination disruption were the most common reasons why students were suspended or expelled. Physical and verbal aggression was the most common reason why students in elementary school and middle school received exclusionary discipline. Insubordination disruption was the most common reason among high school students. Male students received exclusionary discipline for physical and verbal aggression and for insubordination disruption at higher rates than females. Except for Asian students, racial and ethnic minority students received exclusionary discipline for both these reasons at higher rates than white students. Students in special education received exclusionary discipline for these reasons at higher rates than students not in special education. Nearly 40% of students who were suspended received more than one suspension over the school year. Approximately 1% of elementary school students, 5% of middle school students, and 3% of high school students were suspended more than once over the year. Male students received multiple suspensions at a rate 3 times higher than female students. American Indian, Black, Hispanic, and multiracial students received multiple suspensions at higher rates than white students. Asian students received multiple suspensions at lower rates than other students. Students in special education received multiple suspensions at a rate 4 times higher than students not in special education. Students who were suspended at least once during 2011 and 12 were suspended an average total of 3.3 school days. In addition, among students receiving at least one suspension, elementary school students suspended an average total of 2 school days, middle school students an average of 3 days, and high school students an average of 4 days. Male students were suspended for roughly half a day more than female students in elementary school and 1 day more in high school. In middle school, the difference was negligible. In elementary school, the average total days suspended was approximately 1 day greater for black students than for white students. It was slightly less for Asian and Hispanic students than for white students. In middle and high school, average total days suspended was nearly the same for students of different races and ethnicity, except that it was less for Asian students in middle school. So in summary, our findings were that 6.4% of students were removed from classroom instruction for disciplinary reasons. In general, racial and ethnic minority students received exclusionary discipline at higher rates than white students. Students in special education received exclusionary discipline at higher rates than students not in special education. Male students received exclusionary discipline more often than females. Nearly 40% of students who were suspended received multiple suspensions over the year. And the average total number of school days suspended was 3.3 days for students who were suspended at least once. Thank you very much. This is Art Burke. On behalf of myself and Vicki, we hope you'll read our report, and we welcome any questions you may have about it.
Thank you so much, Art and Vicki. It looks like there are no specific questions about your report, but people may still be digesting the info, so I'm sure we'll get more during the Q&A session. And so now I'd like to turn this over to our Research Alliance members, our practitioners who have been involved in this study from the point of inception to collaboration in developing the reports. And so first up is Sho Shigeoka from Oregon's Beaverton School District. Sho?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this webinar this afternoon. It is afternoon, correct? The issue of racial disproportionality in discipline has existed as long as I can remember being an educator, and I believe the root causes for this issue directly relates to the access, opportunity, and achievement gaps that hinder the success of many of our kids today. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to talk about the process that we have taken in the Research Alliance work, as well as in my own district on how we have translated research into practice. But before I do that, I need to make a concession. Given that I'm in this tiny room surrounded by a group of researchers, I've always felt the pressure, and I have always known about the importance of using research to guide my practice. But as a practitioner, I'm constantly just putting out fires, and when it comes down to research, I have a huge pile of books and articles about school improvement on my nightstand, thinking, oh, I'll get to these books and articles on the weekends or the summer, and realistically speaking, I just have not had the time or the skills really to conduct meaningful research to guide my practice. So I used to think researchers only focus on answering research questions that fulfilled their research agenda, not necessarily questions that were relevant to my district's most pressing needs. And I also used to think research findings came in this 500-page document 5 years later, much too late to make a difference to address our immediate needs. And my guess is that I'm not the only practitioner with these assumptions about research and researchers. And I'm happy to report that I'm now recovered from being a research skeptic and here today working side by side with the researchers.
That's great to hear.
So my involvement in the Oregon Leadership Network task force that Vicki talked about earlier has really completely changed my assumptions about research and its relationship to practice. It has also served as a catalyst for change.
I'm sorry, everybody. It sounds like we've lost audio for our colleagues at REL Northwest. We'll just pause for a minute here to give them a chance to come back online. But I really do appreciate Sho's comments about working with researchers. The Research Alliances are definitely intended to cultivate that sort of partnership and to bridge that gap between researchers and practitioners. We want to make sure that these are partnerships and not one-way directional flows of information. The researchers gain as much in participating in these research alliances as the practitioners, and so it truly is intended to be a collaboration. And that's a big change from some of the research models that exist right now.
Okay, I'm back on. I'm sorry. I don't know
great.
what happened. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome back.
Thank you. So where was I? I was explaining about our common goal was, again, to reduce the number of days students of color were missing due to in and out of school suspensions and expulsions. And how we came to this common goal was really driven by the research findings that Art and Vicki talked about earlier. And in my own context, I brought this common goal to my middle school principals. And why middle schools? So can we go back to slide 28, please? One of the slides that Art had. So when you look at this, middle school is when the number of exclusionary practices spikes. And this pattern is also consistent in my own district. And the pattern that you see here is also found in my district, except for our Native American students. We have a very small Native population, but we have a pretty high concentration of Latino students. And this data that you see here was really consistent in my own district, in my middle schools. So we decided to focus our efforts on supporting our Black and Latino kids. And based on this research finding about offense type, what we noticed is that more subjective behavior, such as verbal aggression, insubordination, and disruption, resulted in exclusionary practices. And this was also the case in our middle schools. So I had my principals analyze this data and ask them to think about the location where these behaviors take place the most. Any guess? And again, I can't hear any of you, but it's the classroom. So we noticed that the most referrals come from the classroom. So we said we need to focus on that. And can you go back to 37? Go up. Thank you. So in addition to having these quantitative findings from the researchers, we as OLN districts asked REL Northwest researchers to provide us with a literature summary on promising practices around addressing discipline disproportionality. And this work was done exclusively for the OLN Alliance. And the time between the request to the delivery of the summary was extremely speedy. And once again, this totally dispelled my assumptions about research and research findings. It was great. And this summary identified the importance of teachers developing positive, caring student-to-teacher relationships. And now I was armed with research findings about who is excluded the most, for what behaviors, along with what makes a difference. I challenged my middle school principals to develop a SMART goal for the 13-14 school year. The ultimate goal was to reduce the number of days Black and Latino kids were missing due to, again, in and out of school suspensions and expulsions by 10% from the previous year. And the specific strategy that they applied was to support those teachers who disproportionately send Black and Latino kids to the office for subjective behavioral issues. And some of the examples on the ways in which our principals supported the teachers included for them to visit classrooms more often, giving really explicit feedback about instructions, and coaching teachers on how to better handle power struggles that happen in the classroom. And we as a group met on a monthly basis to monitor our progress. And as of 2 weeks ago, at the conclusion of our school year, the middle school principals exceeded their goal. The original goal was a 10% reduction, but we noticed a 60% reduction in a year. And each of the OLN districts applied its own strategies to work toward meeting our common goal of reducing the number of instructional days kids were missing during the 13-14 school year. And most of our participating districts experienced success in ways that we did in Beaverton in my district. Yet we still have a long ways to go to completely eliminate racial disproportionality in discipline. And now that we know what Research Alliance is about and the impact of this collaborative work, we are committed to working together again next year. Our next step is to have a tighter set of data indicators so that we can do a better job of really tracking and monitoring our progress. And the goal here is really to change the student outcomes through changing adult practice. So in order for that to happen, we as practitioners really need tools that are relevant to our own context. In partnership, REL Northwest, we will continue to collectively identify and develop these tools to help schools, such as alternatives to exclusionary practices, revised policy and procedures, and how to have honest and courageous conversations about race in this issue, because we really cannot address the issue of racial disproportionality in the absence of putting race on the table. Many of us as practitioners need tools on how to do that work. So this challenge of eliminating discipline disparities is a significant issue that places large numbers of our students at risk for both short and long-term negative outcomes, not just academically, but also socially, emotionally, physically, and economically. And our success as a nation really hinges on the success of our young kids. And it is imperative that we as a society address this issue. And while practitioners have a significant role to play in addressing this issue, we just cannot do this alone. And with the relationships that I've developed with the researchers here, I've seen changes in adult practices to impact student outcomes. Now that I'm a believer of this research practitioner partnership work, I encourage you, those of you who are listening as practitioners, really to have an open arm and mind to really partner with researchers to address the problem of practice that are real in your context, in your building, in your district. Believe me, there are lots of researchers who are committed to making a difference in the lives of our students. And this collaborative work has held all of us, both, again, practitioners and researchers, accountable for changed outcomes. We did so by co-crafting research questions that are relevant, and also by creating a data-driven culture. Preparing all students to be college and career ready is work, and it takes a large system that includes a variety of players, again, including practitioners and researchers, to be successful. So I really have appreciated the opportunity to be part of this Research Alliance group, and we really could not have made such a huge gain in our work in my district without the data and the support from my fellow colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sho. I think we need to bring you to Washington, D.C. at the next REL directors meeting to, as testimonials to share with our federal client, because I'm so glad that it's working. Your partnership with REL Northwest is working out so well. And now I'd like to turn this over to our colleague, Robert Murphy from MSDE. So, Robert, you're on deck now.
All right. Thank you, Teresa. I'd like to say I'll volunteer to come to Washington, D.C. as well. You guys have been great for us, and it's been a wonderful partnership, and I'm hoping to continue the partnership. So thank you. First, I'd like to thank the REL for the opportunity to participate in the webinar. As Teresa mentioned, my name is Robert Murphy. I'm the program specialist for school completion, student discipline, and alternative programs for the Maryland State Department of Education. I've been in this position for about 8 years. And prior to coming to to the state, I was an administrator in an alternative program or alternative school where I pretty much eliminated out-of-school suspension for anything but fighting. And the only person I suspended was actually the person who hit first, not necessarily the person who swung back or ran or whatever it was. I have to say that my staff was very upset, and I really didn't understand it at that time how passionate and how interesting and intense this conversation is around student discipline. But in my current position, as Alan mentioned earlier, we had the regulations that were released, and there was a lot of public comment on those. But as it relates specifically to the report, our report is actually tied to really what Alan said earlier, which is one of our regulations that was changed as of January 28th of 2014. That regulation was Code of Maryland Regulation 13A. .08.01.21, which require all Maryland public schools to identify disproportionate and discrepant impact in 1 year and within 3 years, or at the end of year 3, after the identification, that these discrepant and disproportionate impact be eliminated. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, the conversations and the experiences have been very as it relates to the report. As I talk about the environmental, systemic, and political reactions, I think environmentally we just really did not know the depth of the challenge. We knew that there would be some discomfort from the numbers, but in some cases we were stunned. Some of our more progressive systems actually were had some of the largest disparities. When you talk to teachers or educators as a whole, we oftentimes think that we're actually acting the same, but what our data told us very clearly is that we weren't acting the same towards all kids, and the data told us we had to be better for all children. And I'd like to also talk about real quickly about kind of the root causes of disproportionality. I think disproportionality really is reflective of the bias and the disproportionality we have going on in society. I'm not necessarily interested in kind of placing the blame on gaps in performance or income. I think, as the earlier presenter talked about, if we need to have a conversation about race, then we need to have a conversation about race. And I think sometimes we dance around that and we say that the issue is really about socioeconomic status and all those things. And all those things do play a role, but at the root, there seems to be an issue of race. And it seems to be African-American children no matter where we are. And I don't believe that there's an African-American underground student network that just causes a bunch of trouble for people in schools. So with that, I'll move back to my comments on the REL report. I think there's the systemic piece that we had to deal with was it gave the State Department of Education and the local school system a heads up that we needed to manage this issue not just at the school level but universally. Systems have been very proactive in asking us to provide them with supports on policies, procedures, practice, and program. So on the policies, from the policy standpoint, we've been updating codes of conduct for all over the state. That was actually a part of our work with the the regulations that were passed as we updated the codes of conduct. We've also been using utilizing other discipline regulations to their benefit. Some in the state did not know that there is a regulation in our law that allows for students to not necessarily be removed for the whole school day, but to be removed from a particular class for a few minutes or whatever to calm themselves down. And to give the teacher kind of some time to calm themselves down as well, then bring the student back into the classroom. So we've changed the code of conduct, or we've updated the code of conduct, and we also are trying to provide a reservoir of supports for managing student discipline. Quite frankly, we're asking people to do things a lot different. And that is, when you go through teachers' colleges or you go through preparation, oftentimes, or at least in Maryland, there is not the training provided in classroom management or appropriate or developmentally appropriate behaviors. So again, we're asking people to really change their behaviors. So policy-wise, we're trying to do some things. We're trying to do some things around preparation. From a procedure standpoint, some systems have actually simply changed how they manage the process of suspension. That is, suspension that for longer than 5 days has to go up to the superintendent for the superintendent's decision. Oftentimes, we've heard a lot of conversation about discretion for principals, and we certainly should have discretion for principals, but we can't have discretion without accountability. So that is a part of our procedure as well, and that's actually what some of the school systems have done in requiring that if a student is going to be suspended longer than 5 days, it has to go to the actual superintendent. The other thing, as I talked about earlier, a little bit about practice, is, again, educators have not been trained on and really don't have a whole lot of experience on alternatives to suspension, relationship building, and quite frankly, our enrollment in Maryland public schools has really shifted. So we've got now we're a majority person of color school system or statewide system, but the majority of our teachers are 75% are actually white women. And that's not to say one thing or the other, but we don't necessarily have the balance as it relates to our frontline staff in dealing with students of color. So we've also kind of probed some ways to kind of address that. As it relates to programs, we've been really working with our partnerships with the philanthropic community. We are raising awareness and skill building opportunities for teachers. We actually will be delivering several trainings for teachers. One will actually be July 28th through April 2nd. We'll offer a lot of trainings, restorative practices, OVAS, bullying. There will also be some things about relationship building. There will also be some conversations that will provide, again, for people around equity and around race. And again, our philanthropic community has been great. A shout out to the Open Society Institute that's really been helpful in providing the resources to host some of these trainings. Now, what we're also talking about doing in those trainings is not only bringing school staff, but identifying kind of almost like director of student services, excuse me, a director of student services, some school staff, but then also an emerging leader in the system, so we actually have some sustainability. Oftentimes we train people, and unfortunately those people retire or they move on or whatever it is, and so what we've kind of built into our training modules or built into our training teams is to identify someone who's an emerging leader, whether that be a teacher or behavior specialist, whatever it is, or whatever that person is, to help them gain the skills necessary so then they can kind of keep the message and keep the skill level going. Moving on to the next slide.
Robert, are you also using PBIS?
Yes, we are. We are also using PBIS. Yes, we are. So as it relates to how we're using the report, I think I kind of talked about that. We're really doing a lot of professional development. I think in between now and the end of the school year, we have something like 4 or 5 different professional development opportunities for school systems around helping their staff, school staff, get what they need, and then also having the district level staff kind of get the supports they need to manage this issue. We've also done, and this is just tried in one county, we actually did some action planning around some like next steps. We've also identified kind of the most challenging schools in the state, and so what we've done is in a pilot program asked a school to, or a couple of schools in the district, to actually kind of action plan around, short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals, and how they're going to, achieve those things, as well as kind of some short-term wins. What are things that you can do immediately that can actually kind of address the challenge of disproportionality or disparities in your school? The last piece is again, as it relates to supports of pro-social codes of conduct, we have redesigned our code of conduct, or our statewide guidelines for code of conduct, and they will be going to the Maryland State Board as of July 22nd. So we've developed a code of conduct, as Alan talked about earlier. We have had the primary reason why students are being suspended, and 60% of African American suspensions are really related to disrespect and subordination, and that particular code. So what we've tried to do is address that code, and in the state guidelines document, eliminate some of the issues we might have with out-of-school suspension. In Maryland, a suspension is an excused absence, so all students receive their work, and all students receive their full credit for their work, whether they be special ed or regular or traditional educational students. So we've done that. We've also eliminated some categories from our code that actually were some of the reasons. I think Alan talked earlier about the other category, refusal to obey school rules, which was a part of that, which was a huge contributor to the disparities. Those numbers were huge, particularly for middle and high school students. We also looked at we're also looking at how we prepare teachers. And so there will actually possibly be some changes to the standards and expectations in a Maryland teacher, what a Maryland teacher will need to be an actual Maryland teacher. And then kind of last is really the hearts and minds conversations. And these have actually been very helpful. One of the great things in talking with the teachers across teachers and administrators across Maryland is it's not that they don't want to, it's not that they purposely do these things. And actually when they're presented with the data, they're actually shocked, appalled, and quite frankly embarrassed. And so what we're trying to do really is have these kind of hearts and minds conversations, which have been pretty fruitful and very successful with people changing their practice. And, we're doing these in local school systems. So local school systems are bringing people together, oftentimes around PBIS conferences. And we're having these conversations. I actually just had one Tuesday morning, and people were very receptive, and people just want the tools to actually be better, and that's what we're attempting to provide them with, the professional development opportunities and oversight and support from the State Department of Education. So I would like to thank you for the opportunity, and I guess I am opening it up for questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And actually, there's one question that I'd like to open it up with, and this came in earlier. So this is for both Robert and Sho. So are you seeing any changes in practice or administrators not reporting suspensions as suspensions because of this awareness about the disproportionality? Or is there some sort of strategic reporting happening there that might affect?
We have not. I've heard different things from teachers. And one of the things that I don't necessarily know that we've done the best job is communicating the message. So there's been some negative publicity that has said that we don't want any students to be suspended. And, the state board has been very clear, and the department's been very clear. If a student is dangerous and violent and is dangerous to themselves or to a peer or something, or someone, we certainly need to remove that student from the school. But we have not. We've heard the opposite, that we're allowing everybody to stay in school. So no, I have not heard the people fudging numbers around suspension or disproportionality.
Thank you. Sho, did you want to respond?
Sure, that's a great question. And in fact, I did pose that question to my principals, and I was very clear with them up front. This is not about fudging numbers. But in fact, what I did hear from the principals is that so when they received referrals from the classrooms, that, oh, this kiddo was being disruptive and you need to suspend them. And some of the principals did tell me that they used to kind of automatically suspend them without really taking a deep look at, so what really caused this behavior to take place. So some of the principals did say that they really did change the way they exercise their rights to suspend students, if that makes sense. And I have also seen change in practice because I have this luxury of visiting schools and watch principals in practice. And I've noticed more and more principals who are having more individual conversations with their teachers. Like I noticed this one principal when I was following her, went into the classroom and noticed some, again, just different ways of dealing with student behaviors. And this principal had a conversation afterward with the principal, and not in an accusatory kind of a way, but just more in a coaching way around, so anything caused this kind of a power struggle to happen between you and a student. So I noticed change in practice on the part of principals, again, them serving as more of an instructional coach and guide. And some of the principals really changed their system piece, such as implementing restorative justice as a school-wide kind of a practice, to really expecting their teachers to call home when they notice positive behaviors of those kids who were historically being sent to the office versus calling home just because Johnny did this today and you got to do something about this at home. So again, really changing practice in those areas.
Great. Thank you. And so I also would like to share a couple of questions to our report authors. Both of these have to do with looking at subgroups. So one is, does disproportionality between black and white students, did you look at SES difference? So for example, is the disproportionality still hold, does it still hold when you look at high poverty black students versus high poverty white students?
This is Alan Porowski, and we actually did have free and reduced meals or the farm variable in the data, but since the report was really focused in on measuring the magnitude of disproportionality specifically called out in the proposed legislation about race, ethnicity, and special education status, we didn't look at that specifically. That's definitely something that would be interesting to look into, and something we could provide to MSDE as an additional follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that would be interesting. I think we can sort of assume that high poverty black students will probably be will experience more disciplinary actions than high SES white students. So it'll be interesting
and that speaks exactly to Robert's comment before about the intersection of race and SES.
Yep. And there's another question about gender differences. So most kids in special education tend to be boys, so about 2/3 of them are male. Did you see whether female special ed students are disproportionately more disciplined than female non-special ed?
This is Alan again. Yeah, this is Alan again. And I was looking through because I remember, as a matter of fact, when we delivered the report, and something I think would be helpful for a lot of people out there in the audience to know about the REL and how we work is the report that we develop is really the kind of the core assistance that we provided to MSDE, but Robert did have some follow-up questions, and I believe there was one on gender. And I was looking through, trying to find my results on that, but I do know that we did start to run data on gender. But my short-term memory is not so good. So
my long-term memory is actually very good, Alan. I can comment to that if you want to. Actually, it's actually funny because when Alan ran the numbers, I was actually kind of stunned. Oftentimes we think of disproportionality, and and boys are suspended more than girls, so we think of the issue of boys. But the reality is when we broke it down by race, and it's girl to girl. Quite frankly, African American females, the rate of disproportionality or relative risk ratio between them and white girls was in some cases significantly worse than it was for black boys and white boys.
Mm-hmm.
And that was whether we're talking middle school or elementary. We're actually, one of the systems we looked at elementary school, and it was very, very surprising. But no matter what the level of schooling was, whether it was elementary, whether it was middle or it was high, African American females, don't quote me on this, but I want to say were in most cases 2 to 3 times that, in some cases even 4 times that of white females.
Wow. Oh, well, I'm glad that you had that statistic in mind. That's really a big difference. We had a request whether we would be able to share the Maryland Code of Conduct. I think that's on your website, isn't it?
The old one may be, and there might be one. It's not the updated one because the updated one will go for the board July 22nd. And as soon as we get the okay, I certainly will be free. I'll share that with you guys.
That's great. Thank you. And so, so if we can continue on with this with the school board, what was the reaction of your school boards, in Maryland and also in Oregon, to learning about the magnitude of these disproportionalities? How did they react?
I'll let Sho go first. I've been talking.
This is Vicki from Oregon, and we work with the Oregon School Board Association, which provides a state-level board policy for districts around this issue. And I think that if we know that this is, and before this report, I think everybody was aware that this was a problem, a very long and persistent problem within the state. And they used this report as a way to begin to have meaningful conversations about what to do next. And at the board level, what we worked out with the State Board of Education and between districts is a way to organize how we think about policy to practice and what kinds of policies need to be in place at the board level, what kinds of policies that districts should think about, and what should go into practice and policies at the student handbook level that communicates to students and teachers and parents about the procedures that the district will use to address discipline. So I think we thought about this differently, and it wasn't like this was brand new information, but it was information that was given to people who had made a commitment to do something about it.
And for us, it depends on, it truly depends on the system. Some have been very eager to hear the information and, to ask for supports. Some others have not been as eager, but recognize that they have to do something and have been seeking supports from MSDE or whatever services we can provide. One of the biggest challenges that we've heard consistently from the local school systems is the need for resources and possibly hiring extra staff to manage these types of issues. And unfortunately, we have not been able to deliver that. We can provide them with the training, but as everyone knows, budgets across the country are pretty much constricted and constrained. So we haven't really been able to offer anything up. We're actually applying for a couple of federal grants to possibly support these initiatives.
Thank you. I've got several questions here, but let me, since we just talked about Maryland and relative ratios, so Alan, it was very interesting to see there was a wide range in relative rate ratios, disproportionality across the different SEAs, LEAs in Maryland. So what do you think accounts for the fact that some districts have higher levels of disproportionality than others?
Yeah, the rates were the differences in the rates were quite jarring actually. We were expecting if we had to guess before we started the analysis, we would have guessed that there would have been a relatively steady range of disproportionality, or relatively tight range of disproportionality, I should say. When we saw that range between 2 and 5.55, that really started to get us thinking about it. And I did get a follow-up question actually through my LinkedIn account a few weeks back, and it was about looking at one of the districts in particular. And as we started thinking about how these numbers come together and how disproportionalities are measured, we have to keep in mind that the relative rate ratios are based on the ratio of discipline among one group to a referent group, which is either white students or students who are not enrolled in special education. So if the rate of discipline for the referent group is very low, so by extension, if the rate for white students is very low, then even a relatively low rate in discipline among minority students may produce large disparities. So the amount of disparity could be a function of the denominator in a low rate for white students. So even a quote-unquote average rate of discipline for black students could create these high relative rate ratios. But that being said, it really still doesn't explain that at the most basic level, there's still these disproportionalities in that if districts had success reducing suspensions for white students, why are they not having the same success in reducing suspensions or expulsions for black students? So there are some explanations, and when you look at the formula, it becomes clear where maybe some of this could be due to low rates of suspension among white students. But regardless of what that ratio is, it still begs the question about why are we seeing these disproportionalities at the level we are.
So some contextual factors are coming into play there,
Exactly.
Local cultures and practices.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting question about have any of you had experience with positive peer pressure as a way of promoting positive behavior? Robert?
I mean, I've different schools. You've had some schools. I know in some cases where students there's been a very serious act of violence, like a student may have been murdered or something. You have kids creating peace communities in their schools, and that's kind of a way of supporting kind of a positive peer culture. But I don't necessarily know if, I guess that is positive peer pressure. But that's kind of what I've heard is students kind of banding around a particular subject or issue and saying enough is enough and supporting one another.
Well, the positive peer pressure that I got to witness, again, was among the principals that I got to work with, that they were really providing really positive pressure to each other to really look at their own practice. So there's this level of really healthy competition about, so what are you doing differently about this? And so from that perspective, I definitely saw positive peer pressure among principals. And as far as kids' positive peer pressure goes, I know that many principals are, again, implementing PBIS and using restorative justice as a practice where students are invited to be in a circle setting where they really get to talk about how a certain behavior impacted them and what they're going to do things differently to make things right. So again, students definitely have an opportunity to talk about issues, talk about challenges, talk about how they're going to work together to make a difference. So they are definitely providing that positive peer pressure for one another to really create this, again, positive learning environment for all students.
We haven't talked about parents. What about either sharing the report findings with parents and community members, or how are your districts and state involving parents?
Again, I guess I'll go then. So we've provided this report to pretty much all the stakeholders. We've given it to the Maryland Parent Teachers Association. We've gone over with local school systems. We actually we've kind of done a listserv, kind of a blast to everyone. And then also people are requesting that that because I'm primarily responsible for I guess monitoring and reviewing the disproportionality piece, is I've just been coming out doing a lot of talks with parents and community organizations around this particular subject and around this particular report and what we're trying to do to address the issue.
This is Vicki, and parents have been very much an integral part of our work. I think that each of the districts are very aware of the powerful influence and partnership that parents can provide in terms of building discipline policy and also partnering and looking at potential solutions. The Oregon State Department of Education formulated what they call a school discipline advisory committee that includes a broad spectrum of not only K-12 schools, but also juvenile justice and community organizations that are involved in this work. A co-chair of that is a leading parent who also has a great deal of networking around parent organizations so that we have strong parent voice in that organization. That discipline committee receives regular updates on the REL Northwest work, not only this research report, but also the other task force alliance work around policy and around practice. The other thing that we're doing at REL Northwest is translating this report into more user-friendly kind of information that can be shared with parents by the district, so that as they begin next year, this will continue to motivate conversations around this important topic.
And Teresa, if I might add as well, like we had parents that were involved in our code of conduct work group that helped us develop the code of conduct. We also had parents involved in the discipline regulations. So we've had parents involved, not necessarily have we developed a committee or something like that. We had them on the committees that we developed these documents from and these policies from.
That's great. Thank you guys so much. So I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here, and I want to just throw out one last question. And this might be the so what question, okay? So discipline disparities, we've known about them. They've been a problem for a long time. So do you think how can these reports make a difference? And I ask that of both presenters and the discussants.
This is Alan. I did want to say that, there's definitely a lot of information here, and I think as a lot of the audience has probably noticed that a lot of the information that was produced by REL Atlantic and REL Northwest does converge quite well. When we think about these disproportionalities, I think a lot of what we've done here is we've measured the problem, and I think what it really does, and one thing that I've said before, which still holds, is that I view these reports as really a conversation starter. We know now that there's some pretty stark differences in disproportionality between black students and white students, and between special education students and non-special education students. So for us, the big question now is, how do we do this in a way that's going to, or how do we understand this problem at a deeper level, to the point where we not only have solutions for how to work with parents and school boards and develop the regulations, but how do we basically get everyone on the same page about what the issues are? How do we basically make this make it self-evident that basically suspending or expelling kids from school is not a viable long-term solution for the kids or for the parents or for the schools. And having those kind of conversations, I'm hoping, are facilitated by just looking at these numbers and starting to digest exactly what these numbers mean. So the short of it is that I think that this is really a conversation starter, but certainly not the last word on what we need to do next.
This is Vicki from Oregon, and we agree with Alan completely that the reports help to stimulate conversation to a group of people that had already made a commitment to do something about this work. And I think the Oregon report, as they looked at it and what the task force members and the Research Alliance really wanted to have information about, was not just on disproportionate rates across groups, but they wanted to think about more deeply about what is the time lost in classroom instruction, and what about students that have multiple suspensions and expulsions. And they defined exclusionary discipline not just as out of school, but also in school. So we really are focusing in on that metric of how much classroom instruction is lost in this conversation. The other thing that they wanted was some kind of baseline. There was no mechanism that they had to really look as an alliance of 6 districts on if we begin to think about differences in policies and practices, are we making a difference in eliminating, in reducing suspensions and expulsions overall, and in eliminating the discipline gap. And so they wanted a metric to do that, and that was useful, and a way of tracking progress across time. And so that this report became a tool for us to look at in developing that dashboard of indicators.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the prior commenters. For us, it gave us a baseline, as Alan mentioned and I mentioned as well. This is a part of our new discipline regulations, which go into effect next school year. So this kind of gives us kind of a heads up as to where we are, and it also will let us know where we need to be. I think also tying it, I think someone else talked about tying it to performance, and as it relates to students missing time. I mean, you're looking at, I think we suspended something like, we had something like 92,000 suspension events last year. If you're looking at the amount of time that those students missed, and those students who were suspended 2, 3, 4, 5 times, as we transition to Common Core, which isn't about passing someone a ditto or going to a book. It's really about a lot of classroom and student engagement. It's important that these kids are actually in the building. And then the last piece, I think, and Alan began with this, and so I will end with this. I think it's the starting of a convo or a conversation around hearts and minds, and the issue of race and socioeconomic status, and a lot of other things that I think has been in front of us, but oftentimes we have kind of we haven't really had the substantial conversations about it.
Thank you. I think both Beaverton and MSDE are very lucky to have such committed and passionate leaders to really help continue this conversation and to start in on some serious solutions to disproportionality. So thank you all so very much. I'm going to ask Sharon to please close out the thank you, the question pod. And I wanted to invite you to continue the conversation. I have a link there in the question pod for our forums. And so this particular forum we set up specifically for the disproportionality webinar, to continue the discussion from this webinar. And we'll also post the Maryland Code of Conduct there when it's ready. I've also put up a slide here for additional resources on disproportionality. And so this Regional Resource Center program has a page which is a nice jumping point where it's got links to federal centers, training modules, resources, articles, state web pages, additional tools and templates. And I also want to throw in a plug for our the Mid-Atlantic Equity and the Region 10 Equity Assistance Center. The equity centers deal with a lot of the Office of Civil Rights kinds of questions, and so they have a tremendous amount of expertise to share. So just a plug in for our colleagues there. And so before you leave, I'd like to ask you to please take a minute to complete our participant satisfaction feedback survey. I promise it really is brief, and we do take your comments very seriously, and it does help us improve our work. And so, Sharon, if you'll shoot them over there, I would appreciate it. But otherwise, I thank you for your participation, and we hope that you will join us in future webinars. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our presenters and our discussants as well. Have a good day. Bye-bye.